Thank you very much, Ryan. I appreciate that. Uh, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Ambassador Jeff Flake and his wife Cheryl. They're both with us today. For those of you that know Jeff or Cheryl, you know that they come together. They're a full package. And we're grateful, Cheryl, that you're here. Ambassador Jeff Flake just recently returned from diplomatic service as the United States ambassador to the Republic of Turkey. Prior to his ambassadorial service, Senator Flake represented Arizona in the United States Senate from 2013 to 2019, and before that, he spent more than a decade in Congress representing Arizona in the House of Representatives. Prior to entering Congress, Ambassador Flake served as executive director of the Goldwater Institute in Arizona. He also directed the Foundation for Democracy in Namibia during that nation's transition to independence, and he has a great love for Southern Africa and has spent a lot of time there. Ambassador Flake holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from BYU, as well as a master's degree in political science from BYU as well. Ambassador Flake is often a contributor to CNN, CBS News. He's guest lectured at Stanford, Princeton, Yale. He was a resident fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller Conscience of a Conservative, A Rejection of Destructive Politics, and A Return to Principle. Ambassador Flake currently divides his time between Utah and Arizona. He serves as chairman of the board of World Trade Center Utah, as well as being the director of the Institute of Politics at Arizona State University. And he is here on campus in the capacity as a distinguished visiting fellow at BYU. At the end of this month, he's going to be knighted by the Swedish government. I don't know, is anybody else in that particular category? But he's attracted a lot of attention in Sweden and will receive the Order of the Polar Star for his role, particularly when he served as ambassador to Turkey for helping to secure Sweden's entry into NATO. Ambassador Flake and his wife Cheryl are the parents of 5 grown children and 6 grandchildren, and he's a great friend to BYU. We're grateful for his time today. He's a busy guy. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Jeff Flake to BYU.
Thank you, Quinn. It's great to be here. I appreciate this invitation. It's nice to see a full room. And I'll speak a little today about the principles of peacemaking in the international arena, and then bring it back and talk about domestic politics as well. But first, let me just say it's great to be on BYU's campus. Cheryl and I met at BYU Hawaii on the first day of school on the beach. When we should have been in school, we were at the beach. This is unfortunately a true story, but 7 years later, to reminisce, we went back to that spot on Temple Beach, Hukilau, right in front of the school where we met. We reminisced, and then we drove up to the school. I told Cheryl, I said, this has changed quite a bit. I said, that's a new building on the right. She said, no, that's the library. That was here when we were, but I didn't know it. But anyway, fortunately, we came here to Provo and got a little more serious about our studies, or at least me. But it's great to be back here. Ambassadors are, of course, diplomats. And the primary goal of diplomacy is to appeal for peace, to stay away from conflict, and to avoid war. Any ambassador who is doing his or her job well is first and foremost a peacemaker. Now, as students here at the Kennedy Center know well, there are 2 types of ambassadors out there. There are the career foreign service officers. That's about 2/3 of the Corps there. And then there are political appointees. Among the latter group, they're usually friends of the president or those who had contributed significant amounts of money to the president. or among that latter group are sometimes former politicians like me, who didn't contribute money. But when the White House asked if I might consider an ambassadorship, I said yes, but only if it's really consequential. They overshot the mark by quite a bit. If you look at Turkey, and I'll probably slip back and forth, Turkey, we've always known it as Turkey. Just a couple of years ago, the Turkish government said they wanted the world to pronounce it as Turkish people do, Türkiye. So we try, but sometimes we slip back into old habits, so forgive me when I do. But I have to say, sometimes when I was being summoned by the foreign minister or beating my head against the wall to try to get the Turks to help us more on Russian sanctions, I would think of a couple of my other former colleagues from the Senate who had been appointed ambassador. Tom Udall was on a beach somewhere in New Zealand, I'm sure. And then Joe Donnelly, he was ambassador to the Vatican. Now, if you're an ambassador suing for peace, how tough can an ambassadorship to the Vatican be? You've got one client, it's a pope. But I still would say we were grateful to be in Turkey. It was certainly not boring. Napoleon once said, if the world were one country, Istanbul would be its capital. So it is centered around the world. If you look at the neighbors, if you go, counterclockwise around the horn here, you've got Syria, you have Iraq, you have Iran, you have Armenia, or Azerbaijan, then Armenia, and Georgia. And you have the Black Sea, you have Russia obviously here, Ukraine up here, Bulgaria, Greece. So it is a significantly difficult neighborhood. Just to give you another idea of how central Turkey is, when I was there, I swam from Asia to Europe. Now, it's not as impressive as it sounds. If you're in Istanbul and you swim across the Bosphorus Strait, you have swum from Asia to Europe or from Europe to Asia. And they sponsor a swim every year. We started there, and you get out in the middle, and if you swam straight across, it'd be just less than a mile, but the current kicks in, and you swim about 4.1 miles until you exit, hopefully. If you don't finish within 2 hours, they pluck you out of the water, so the traffic, the oil carriers and other ships won't run over you. But it was a great experience to be there, and it is right in the middle, obviously, of everything. When I was nominated to be ambassador to Turkey, it wasn't universally acclaimed in Turkey. This was posted on X there. There, Jeff, you betrayed Republicans. Mormon cowboy with a K. I really like that. Turkey is not Utah, and you are not Brigham Young. I think I knew that. But they were already declaring me persona non grata. You will not allow Turkey to be destabilized. But fortunately, just a few years before, in December of 2015, after one presidential candidate talked about a Muslim ban and banning any Muslim from coming in the country, Cheryl and I and our two youngest kids at that time went to a mosque in Scottsdale to let the Muslim community know that that was not, one, it is not good, two, it's not constitutional, and we believe in religious freedom. But I gave a speech there titled Mormons and Muslims, and that the video of that made its way around Turkey when I was nominated, and so we were a little better received. There's with Cheryl. I'm not sure why the newspaper article or the television put her in orange, but that was well received as well. When you have a country that is 97% Muslim, they need to know that the U.S. ambassador is not Islamophobic. The key to diplomacy and peacemaking is getting to know those that you are working with and identifying with them wherever you can. Our family motto has always been, assume the best, look for the good. It can be good advice for domestic politics. We'll talk a little about that later. But I wondered, would this work with diplomacy? The U.S. ambassador to Turkey, whom I replaced in 2021, had come within a whisker of being what they call PNG'd, or declared persona non grata, and kicked out of the country. My initial goal was modest: don't get kicked out of the country. But sometimes the Turks would portray the U.S. ambassador as a kind of a puppet master, as there are particular figures who are in the opposition there. I don't remember ever doing that, but that's kind of the figure. But when I arrived in Turkey, every ambassador goes to the presidential palace. You have to be credentialed and accepted by the government. And so I came to meet with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is in his 22nd year, I believe, as head of state. This is his happy face, if you can believe that. But not a particularly warm president, particularly to U.S. ambassadors. But and also the Turkish government had been increasingly intolerant of legitimate dissent. They increasingly saw the free press as a nuisance that could be quashed, and recently purchased a weapon system, the S-400, that was incompatible with Turkey's role in NATO. This latter move had gotten them kicked out of the F-35 program, meaning that they were no longer able to purchase the fifth generation fighter jet that they helped manufacture. In other words, they had a bit of a chip on their shoulder, and I didn't know how it would go. I was wondering, could I assume the best and look for the good in this circumstance? Turkey seemed to be moving away from democratic norms and was not behaving much like an ally. Was there much good to assume? I'm here to tell you that sure there is. There always is, if you are looking to build common ground with individuals, organizations, or countries. If you want to be a peacemaker, you can always find some common ground. In Turkey's case, the country had been hosting nearly 4 million refugees for the past decades, more than any other country in the world, by far. Most were Syrians escaping violence and chaos there. There were also Iranians, Afghans, and persecuted Uyghurs from China. They are a Turkic people. But when tourists and visitors come to Turkey, they always ask, we know that Turkey has a lot of refugees here, where are the camps? Where are the refugee centers? There are none. Refugees have been integrated into Turkish society for the most part. This is commendable. It comes at great financial and political cost to the government there, and they get very little credit from the international community for what they're doing. So whenever I met with President Erdogan or the foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, or gave interviews with the Turkish press, I made a point to compliment Turkey, and especially President Erdogan's big Muslim heart when it came to accepting refugees. You've all been watching the news and what's happened in Syria over the past while. We're hopeful that it's tough to think it would be any worse for the Syrian people, but we're hoping for a better life for them, and obviously Turkey is very involved in that. In February of 2023, Turkey was struck with one of the most massive earthquakes. It was 7.8 on the Richter scale, and another earthquake a few hours later, about 7.6, claimed the lives of more than 50,000 Turks. Now, no government, no matter how prepared, could handle such a problem. The problem is Turkey is a proud country, and they are reluctant to accept help, particularly from countries like the United States. I knew that it would be politically difficult. Early offers of assistance for U.S. search and rescue teams were ignored. So I asked my staff, find out what Turkey has done in response to natural disasters around the world. Have they helped out? And the answer came back. Over the past decade, they had responded to assist dozens of countries experienced natural disasters on 5 continents. Our message immediately then became, Turkey has paid it forward. Now it's our turn to pay back. And they did within 48 hours. We had search and rescue teams coming from Fairfax County, Virginia, and Los Angeles to assist with the quake. Survivors were still being pulled from the rubble 11 days after the quake, like this child, 11 days after. And once again, looking for the good, assuming the best, helped us open doors that would have otherwise remained closed in a critical phase of the disasters. I'm not saying that we didn't still have disagreements. We did, but the relationship warmed to the extent that we were able to work constructively to support Ukraine, for example, and to apply sanctions on Russia. There were many meetings that we had. You'll see President Erdogan, Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister, the head of the intel services, Tony Blinken, and myself. The issue that we spent more time on than anything, of course, was Sweden's accession to NATO. Sweden and Finland decided that a century or two of neutrality was enough, and after Russia invaded Ukraine, they wanted into NATO. The problem is every country that is in NATO has to approve, and Turkey had some real problems with Sweden and their tolerant attitude toward a group, the PKK, who Turkey and the United States and others considered terrorists. And so for 18 months, we had to work to find a formula at which Turkey would approve of Sweden's entry that ultimately involved selling F-16s to Turkey, which we wanted to do, but the Congress had an issue with, but we were able to put together a big negotiation. And finally, the end of January of last year, just a year ago, this was in Washington with the Swedish Prime Minister just after we got the deal done. Now Sweden and Finland are in NATO, and after that we were able to work with the Turks on a number of things. You probably saw in August of this year a large spy swap or prisoner exchange with Russia that involved 24 prisoners, 7 countries, multiple aircrafts, and it took place, this is in Ankara, with some of the detainees. You'll notice Paul Whelan there, who'd been held for years, and then the Wall Street Journal reporter who had been detained by Russia. But the logistics were all handled by Turkey. But it was a great place to be. One of the most fun things, if you're ambassador in Istanbul, is to try to play James Bond on the top of the Grand Bazaar. My former missionary companion was there visiting, and he was up there, and Cheryl said, "You're wearing a suit? Put on your sunglasses and play James Bond." So she took the picture. I put it out on Instagram naively, and within 10 minutes, it was all over the country on every newscast, in every newspaper the next day. And I thought, I'm in trouble. But anyway, the Turks actually treated it well. The manager of the Grand Bazaar, when he did interviews that next day with about every media outlet, said, "No, we filmed so many, action movies up here, and the last James Bond movie wrecked a bunch of tiles. This let people know we fixed it." And so now the nice thing is, if you Google James Bond Grand Bazaar, my picture comes up. So after that, I thought I can leave, I can go home. I've achieved what I wanted to as ambassador. But after 3 years, President Erdogan actually asked me to come into his office when he found out I was leaving. He said, "Why are you leaving? Does Cheryl not like it here?" he said. And he knew that we loved it. As Quinn mentioned, Cheryl had been in Turkey as a BYU young ambassador. She was the young ambassador. I was the old one. The joke's easy to write. But while she was there, she recreated several of the pictures that she took in the 80s, and then again, and the Turks loved it. It was great. She did more as ambassador, I think, than I did in that sense. But President Erdogan invited you, and there's a real happy face. Maybe it's happy because I was leaving. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, I felt at that time, diplomats typically have a number of tools at their disposal, carrots and sticks, and you have to sometimes use both. But a positive message motivates far better than a fear-based message whenever you can use it. And we could use in these days more encouragement and inspiration. This is a region of the world, obviously, that has been through a lot, and they crave peace. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, father of modern-day Turkey, his mantra was peace at home, peace in the world. So let's talk a little about peace at home, domestic tranquility. Moving back in time, in 2001, I was sworn in by Speaker Hastert. Our son Austin there doesn't seem too happy about it all, but we enjoyed being in Washington and being sworn into the House of Representatives. In 2001, the U.S. House of Representatives was a lot more hospitable to bipartisanship than it is today, particularly among senior members on both sides of the aisle. One of the issues I first sunk my teeth into was travel to Cuba. At that time, and still for the most part today, Americans are prohibited from traveling to Cuba. I always thought that was a silly policy. Unless there's a really good national security reason, Americans ought to be able to travel wherever they want. And I thought, maybe naively, that if you really wanted to get rid of Fidel Castro, just make him deal with spring break once or twice. That would serve him right. But anyway, so I introduced legislation to lift the travel ban, and that legislation was more favored by Democrats than it was my party, Republicans. And so one Republican stood up during that debate and said, "The gentleman from Arizona just wants to lift the travel ban so he can drink mojitos on the beach in Cuba." Now, a mojito is a rum-based drink, and anyway, one Democrat, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, David Obey, stood up and demanded that those words be stricken from the record. Now, it's rare that a Democrat would protect a Republican when another Republican is going after that Republican. Usually what you do is let that play out, get some popcorn, and watch. Republicans do the same thing when Democrats are doing it. But he did it. He said those words should be taken down, which means removed from the record. Under House rules, you can't impugn somebody's motives on the House floor. So they discussed it, removed it. The amendment passed, and I went over to Dave Obey afterwards and I said, "Why did you do that? You really don't know me. I'm new here. You're a Democrat, I'm a Republican." He said, "Flake, I know you're Mormon." He said, "I know you don't drink. I was just protecting your honor." I really appreciated that. I never forgot it. I've tried to return the favor whenever I could. Just to give you an idea of how polarized Washington became, I got a taste of it when I decided to play basketball at the White House with President Obama. I was invited to do that, and CNN and other networks were carrying who was been invited and who was there. And I remember being in the White House basement, changing into my basketball clothes, and I got a call that just kept ringing, and I answered it. It was a Capitol Hill switchboard, and they said, "We've got somebody who really has to talk to you. Will you take the call?" So I did, and it was a person sobbing uncontrollably on the other end of the line. And I said, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" "You can't play basketball with that man," she said. And I thought, "Why?" I said, "Get a life," and hung it up and went and played ball. But I just thought, man, we have gone too far when the situation is you can't play basketball with somebody from the other party. One of the best traditions in Washington is the baseball game, Republicans against the Democrats. It's Republicans against Democrats once a year, played at National Stadium. We usually draw at that point more than the Nationals, which said more about their losing records than it did about us, and we forced our interns to come and watch us play. But anyway, I played that every year for 18 years. It was a highlight of my time in Congress, I think. But and I was safe, by the way, on that slide. That's Senator Murphy from Connecticut. But in 2017, the day before the game, Republicans gathered to practice in Northern Virginia at the ball field there. And right near the end of the practice, I'd just taken batting practice, was walking toward the dugout, and somebody yelled, "Shooter, shooter, shooter." And then the shots rang out. And Steve Scalise, our second baseman, was running, and he was hit and immediately fell to the ground. I turned toward the dugout and ran, and I watched the bullets pitching off the gravel in front of me. And I dove into the dugout along with a number of my colleagues, and for the next 8 minutes, the longest 8 minutes of my life, the bullets were whizzing over the dugout just inches above our head. And there was one Capitol policeman there who was part of Steve Scalise's detail, was firing back. And we kept ourselves occupied using a belt to put a tourniquet on one of the staff members' legs who'd been shot. But after 8 minutes, we finally heard the word say, "He's down, the shooter's down." So I jumped up and ran out on the field to Steve Scalise and used my batting glove to plug the hole in his left hip so he wouldn't bleed out. And then to wait for the first responders to arrive. Then I got his phone and had to call his wife and say, "Your husband's been shot." Fortunately, he survived. He still walks with a noticeable limp, but he survived that shooting. But when I think back on that event, what I remember most is when I was running to the dugout thinking, why? How could somebody look at a bunch of middle-aged men playing baseball, trying to play baseball, and see the enemy? And that has stayed with me ever since. Why in the world? How do you see the other side as the enemy? A little later, or when I got to the Senate, I should say, this was just more that morning, I'm sorry. One of the senators I was elected with, we were both in the House together, was Martin Heinrich from New Mexico. Martin was a bit of an adventurous type, and I thought that I was too. We decided that we would prove that Republicans and Democrats can work together, that there can be bipartisanship. And so we planned this for a while, that we would go in the middle of the Pacific and play survivor on an island together, a Republican and a Democrat, and not kill each other. And we thought, we'll take a GoPro camera and we'll get a little footage of it and then give it to Discovery Channel or others. And they can to prove this fact. So we went to Discovery Channel and talked about it. They said, well, we want to come film it. And so they did. So in August of 2014, Martin and I went to the Marshall Islands. They gave us, Discovery Channel, a machete between us, and that was about it. And so we survived for a week, just catching fish, eating raw fish. It turned out our fire-making skills worked a lot better in Arizona and New Mexico, respectively, than in the humid tropics. But it was an incredible experience, and we did survive it and returned. And not one of our colleagues knew that we were doing this exercise, but we got back and then went on the talk show circuit to talk about bipartisanship. I still remember Stephen Colbert ran a clip of us trying to spearfish and said, Jeff Flake and Martin Heinrich proved once and for all that Republicans and Democrats can get along if death is the only option. So, for what it's worth, that has been empirically proven. But there's a saying in Washington that you will never question your colleague's motives if you know the names of his or her children. And I found that to be true. It used to be in Washington, when you were elected to Congress, you would move your family out and stay in Washington until you were defeated or retired. And the families of Republican senators and congressmen would go to school with, recreate, and play with the members of the other party or their kids. That doesn't happen as frequently today. You don't get to know people. And the first principle of peacemaking is to get to know those with whom you have disagreements. And if you do get to know them, you feel a lot better. There was, I was just going to say, as bad as it gets in Washington, we're sometimes reminded of the best of humanity. There was once a practice in Washington called pairing, where if you, as a senator, were going to be absent from a vote, then sometimes you could go unavoidably absent for a vote. You could go to somebody from the other party and say, I'm going to be gone for this. Would you agree to pair your vote, meaning not vote or vote the other way, so my absence won't be determinative? That used to be quite a common practice. But as you can imagine, in a highly polarized environment like the one we have now, any senator who would agree to pair his vote would receive the wrath of the base in his party, saying you can't do that. Thus, the practice has all but vanished. But in April of 2018, President Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, and I was thinking of that today as I was watching Marco Rubio appearing before this Foreign Relations Committee just today to be confirmed. But when Mike Pompeo was up for nomination, that was the committee on which I sat, it was very tight, and the Democrats thought we have a chance of defeating him. Johnny Isakson, a Republican senator from Georgia, was stricken with Parkinson's disease. He was going to retire at the end of his term later that year, but he had to be in Georgia to deliver the eulogy at his best friend's funeral, and thus he was absent from the Senate and absent from the committee during the nomination vote. This meant that the Democrats would have enough votes to block the nominee if he stayed away. Then Senator Chris Coons stepped forward, a Democrat from Delaware, and changed his vote from no to present to allow the nomination to reach the floor as if his friend Senator Isakson had been there to vote. I still remember Bob Corker, the chairman of the committee, talking to reporters afterwards and breaking down crying because he had never seen in his career such an act of sympathy, compassion, and peacemaking. A small act, but these days those go a long way. Last year, the Washington Post ran a story of a man from Utah named Jake. Jake was being sentenced for entering the Capitol building on January 6th in an attempt to overturn what he felt was a rigged election. The judge in the case of Jake's sentencing read a letter from a woman by the name of Andrea. She urged leniency for Jake. Andrea's politics were completely different from Jake's. She detested what had happened in the Capitol. But, Andrea explained to the judge, she knew this man. And she thought that the actions of one day should not determine or define his life. She had learned, she said, not to judge people by their worst day. Now, how did she learn this? Nearly a decade before, Andrea, much under the influence of alcohol, caused a car accident in Colorado that had claimed the life of Jake's sister. Yet Jake and his family, convinced of Andrea's remorse and contrition, had intervened to urge Andrea's judge to shorten her prison sentence. Then a year later, Jake and his family successfully petitioned for Andrea's early release. Andrea wrote to Jake's judge, "It's unfathomable for a family to look at a person who killed their daughter and sister while driving drunk and to wish her a happy life. Yet Jake and his family did. Because of Jake's actions, I've been given a second chance to live a meaningful, productive life." Andrea then urged the judge to do the same for Jake, to not judge him by his worst day. Whenever I'm feeling judgmental or self-righteous, when I feel that in this instance I can't be a peacemaker, I think back on this story. So, how do we bridge the political divide? First and foremost, we have to realize that we are all children of God. Second, we need to recognize, as smart as we think we are, We don't have all the political answer. The person on the other side of the aisle may be just as right or more right than you are. Third, you need to really get to know those with whom you disagree. If you do, you'll be less likely to question their motives or consider them the enemy. And finally, and this should apply to those both within and without of the realm of politics, don't judge people by their worst day, and pray that they don't judge you by yours. After spending 3 years abroad, Cheryl and I had assumed that somebody would fix this partisan divide by the time we returned. It didn't happen. But our time abroad did give us a much greater appreciation for this wonderful country. And it gave us a real reason and imperative to help try to heal the partisan divide rather than to contribute to it. Dallin H. Oaks at the last General Conference said the following: "As followers of Christ, we teach and testify of Jesus Christ, our perfect role model, so let us follow him by foregoing contention. As we pursue our preferred politics in public action, let us qualify for his blessings by using the language and methods of peacemakers. In our families and other personal relationships, let us avoid what is harsh and hateful." That is my hope today, that we can all assume the best and look for the good, whether we are diplomats in our own families or neighborhoods, communities, or schools, or in any other circumstance, that we model behavior befitting who we are and what we believe, and above all, that we try to be peacemakers. Now, I am grateful again to be here. I'm grateful to be among BYU students at the Kennedy Center. Somebody raise their hand if they were there. All right, 2, 3. All right. I don't have the hedgehog that we held during that time. This was in Ankara. We went to our residence there and had an enjoyable pizza evening and a swim. But the best thing Cheryl and I did there was host people from our family and friends and from BYU. In 1 month, in September of 23, we hosted 43 people who stayed and slept at our residence, not all at once, but throughout the month. But we really enjoyed that time and enjoyed having BYU students. And I would encourage anybody who has a chance to get to Turkey to take advantage of the opportunity. But thank you for allowing me to be here, and I guess we may have a few questions.
Thank you. It was a remarkable set of comments. Every Wednesday during our lecture series, we do reserve the last 15 or 20 minutes to bring you into the conversation. And we finish at 1 p.m. We recognize that some of you may have courses at 1 that you need to get to, and you're welcome to leave when you need to get to those classes. But we've got about 15, 20 minutes for you to ask questions to Ambassador Flake. If you have a question, raise your hand. We have a couple of students in the back who have microphones. They'll bring it to you. Once you receive the microphone, please stand and tell us your name. If you're a student, tell us what you study here at BYU. If you're faculty, staff, or a member of the community, just introduce yourself briefly, and we'll go until 1 p.m. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Tyler. I'm from Iowa, studying political science. I have a question. When the United States and Turkey had opposing views, and it seemed like you couldn't find compromise, what were some strategies or things you found successful in bridging differences that initially might have seemed incompatible?
Well, thanks. That came up quite often. Like I said, one thing you try to do is find some common ground that you do have, and if they know that you're coming, coming not as a way to punish them, but to help them, then you have a better time. Let me just take the one that I mentioned the Sweden's accession to NATO. This is something that the Turkish people really did not want. Um, about 30 to 40,000 Turks had lost their lives to PKK terrorism over the past couple of decades, and they associated Sweden's attitude toward the PKK as far too tolerant. And so whenever we'd get close to the Turks agreeing to do it, there'd be a PKK bombing somewhere, and it would be difficult. But one thing that you find out what they want. One thing they wanted was to be able to remain compatible with NATO with F-16 aircrafts, and that's something that the U.S. had held back on. And so in this instance, we found a way to bring those things together. That was a bit transactional, but that's what you do a lot with diplomacy. But also sometimes on human rights issues, for example, there are things that Turkey was doing that we didn't agree with. And sometimes you don't want to be in a lecturing mode, particularly from the United States, the big brother to everyone. But if you can point out that this is inconsistent with your own constitution or your own standards or your own conventions and agreements with other entities, not just the United States. So you look for any method that you can do, but that's a great question.
Hi, my name is Ellie Bradley. I'm from Oklahoma and I'm an English major here at BYU. You mentioned that in a diplomat's toolbox there are both carrots and sticks. Would you mind kind of explaining like why different situations would constitute the use of either tool?
Great. Well, on this one, I mentioned that Turkey had purchased a Russian weapon system that was incompatible with being a NATO ally. It would give the Russians information if they used it. And that was a situation where it was a pretty big stick. We removed them from the F-35 program, so they couldn't purchase. And we couldn't even deliver 6 F-35 aircraft that they owned. We couldn't deliver them to them. So that would be an example of a stick. As far as carrots, there are trade preferences, free trade agreements, visa preferences, and other things that you can always offer. P.J. O'Rourke once said that there are 2 constant things at any U.S. embassy abroad. One group of people protesting the United States and another group of people waiting in a long line for visas to the United States. And so there's always that dichotomy, and you make use of it. Everyone, no matter which country, they all want to come to the United States, if not to study, to go to Disneyland or something else. So yeah, it just depends on the circumstances. As I mentioned, it's much better if there are incentives and positive things that you can offer than sticks, but sometimes you do have to use them.
I'm
Yes.
Noah Lee from Melbourne, Australia, studying history. With regards to Turkish intervention in Syria following the fall of Assad, what are your concerns and what are your hopes? And do you think there's prospects of avoiding any kind of further Turkish intervention?
Great. Yes, the main opposition group in Syria that took over was a Turkish-sponsored group, HTS. Turkey has there are some who are saying that this was Turkey's design all along. They want more of Syria. I can tell you they have no design to take over Syria, but they do want a stable Syria. They have been very kind and generous to nearly 4 million refugees, but that is a big political cost, and additional refugees would really put strains on a tough economy. And so their interest is having a stable Syria. I see it as positive, frankly. Turkey is 97% Muslim. Syria, not quite as much, more Christian groups there. Our big concern is that everyone is able to practice a religion and have other rights that they've been denied under the Assad regime. And I see Turkey's influence as positive at this point, particularly as Iran's influence has waned. The combination of those 2 things make me hopeful that we're in for a better situation. Good question.
I'm Lamont Tuller. I'm from LEA.
Great.
I'm studying political science. But my question was, you mentioned about our polarization, but I think, how do you get around when people can't agree on even on like basic facts?
Oh, time heals all wounds, I guess. Sometimes that's difficult. It's difficult in families. These days, Thanksgiving can be a tough time. But like I say, your family, and you know that your brother or your sister who may not share your political views is not an awful person. And if you can extrapolate that beyond your family and realize that they have the same feelings toward you, and you hope that they're as forgiving as you need to be. So yeah, but the basic facts things, that's tough. Sometimes we think we're in possession of all the facts, and we usually are. But but yeah, it's just you have to be extend grace and be forgiving and hope they do the same. So there are times when I thought that I had the answer and I didn't. And over time, sometimes you'll change opinions. Every good politician is open to new arguments, or as facts change, then they change the position. And I think we need to remember that. And I just hope you, as well, one thing I would plead with you to do, particularly when you have a tough thing like COVID or whatnot that really exacerbates tensions that are already there, particularly those who are serving in local government, on a school board or a city council, board of supervisors. They have a tough job, and extend a lot of grace there because they're trying to serve a lot of constituents that have different opinions. So, thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, guys. My name is Brett. I'm studying international relations here, and so I was really excited to hear that that's what you got your undergrad in here as well. I have a little bit more of an academic question, because I think if there was ever like a dream career, I think you've had it. And it just sounds like you've had an incredible impact in keeping the peace. And I think that's something that we all want, is to like go and be a really impactful disciple of Christ around the world. And that's one of the things that drew me to BYU in the first place. So I guess I would ask, how much did you find that your education and like the things that you learned in your classrooms, like how much do you feel like that actually prepared you for your career in politics and all those opportunities you had to serve and to lead and direct and such?
No, a great deal. Obviously the background in political science or international relations, that was helpful on the content, but more impactful and more helpful is just the environment that you're here, in BYU. So whether you're studying engineering or business or anything else, and I hope that those who are outside of political science or international relations are considering public service and elected office as well, because that's the most important, to have a value-based education and to learn principles of peacemaking and tolerance, and to extend grace for those that you might disagree with. So, yeah, I think certainly my education, the content of it in IR and political science was helpful, but more helpful is the values-based education I received here.
My name's Joy. I study Russian and linguistics, and my question is kind of pertaining a little bit more to your discussion on NATO alliances.
Right.
I'm curious what you think for the purposes of peace going forward, because obviously Turkey is a very important NATO ally for us. What kinds of changes need to happen between the relationship between Turkey and Russia outside of that relationship?
Great. Well, that was always a frustration. Sometimes you just want to grab your Turkish counterpart and say, "Pick a side, pick a side." But they literally straddle, east and west, and that came to the fore very early. Within 6 weeks of when Cheryl and I arrived, Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and the first thing we desperately needed was for Turkey to close the Bosphorus Strait to Russian warships, to not allow Russia to resupply its ships in the Black Sea. And gratefully, at that time, Russia and probably Turkey thought that this would be over in a week or two. And but when I first went to the Turks and said, please, can you invoke the Montreux Convention to disallow that? They said, no way, no how. And within 5 days, they just got a little closer, and then they did it. And that, as this war has drug on, it turned out to be a massively impactful decision, because now more than a third, closer to a half of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea has been taken out, and they can't resupply. And Turkey was a big part of that. Turkey has always, they've supplied drones and commercial armaments, but also behind the scenes has done a lot more than they like to talk about. Having said that, they depend on Russia for their energy, much like the rest of Europe, and for also tourism and other sales, commercial sales. So it's very difficult for them, and they can't simply say we're going to cut Russia off completely. But there, you as a diplomat, you take what you can get, and you try to push them further all the time. And they were very helpful, using their offices being able to talk to Russia to do the grain deal, for example, to allow for grain to exit the Black Sea, and then the prisoner swap, a few of them when I was there, because they can still talk to Russia. So in some ways we find it helpful, but in some ways it's frustrating at times when you want them to impose all the same sanctions that we're imposing on Russia, and they simply can't do it.
My name is Parker. I'm studying public relations, and I'm from Indiana. You mentioned how traditional news outlets helped calm fears as you were moving into Turkey. How have you seen social media outlets either exacerbate or help a situation?
I'll let you know when I find where they help. I suppose they can, but it's been tough, because social media is immediate and not as reliable. So that's something we're just going to have to go. I think the major outlets are still deciding how they deal with this. Facebook changing their policy recently, Twitter changed, and so. And by the way, I mean, there are perils on all sides of this. Having some board or group of people deciding what is true and what is not, as opposed to readers. There's no one answer that is right and can be employed everywhere. But it's difficult with social media in particular, because it's immediate, and particularly some platforms. Instagram's great because more people are moving there, and you can turn off comments, and that's particularly helpful. Twitter is always, you just assume it's going to be negative, and 9 out of 10 posts are against or anti whatever is out there, and so but you just kind of assume that and go on. But it's a difficult way to move forward, and I suppose we'll see instances where social media helps. Right now, it's more on the other side. One more.
My name is Carter Johnson. I'm from Arizona. I'm studying Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic. I was just wondering, when you were transitioning from your role as senator to being a diplomat, did you receive any specific training for that? And if not, or what was that like? And if not, how were you otherwise prepared?
Great question. They have what they call ambassador school, which takes about 3 weeks. And this was during COVID when I went. It was a little truncated there. Nothing can really prepare you that well. And people often ask, what's the difference when you're a senator and then an ambassador? When you're a senator, you obviously have to answer to your voters, the whole state. There are limits to what you can do if you want to be reelected or popular. But other than that, you kind of have free reign. These are the committees I want to serve on. This is what I focus on. This is what I don't. When you're an ambassador, you don't have that luxury. You're not a free agent. You're there to represent the United States and this administration. Fortunately, I'm a Republican appointed by a Democrat. I would have had a harder time, perhaps, on domestic policy, defending the current president's positions. But on foreign policy, there's an old adage that politics stops at the water's edge. That's not completely true, but it's more true than not. And I was completely comfortable with the administration's positions with regard to that region and Turkey. And this was a wonderful post because it's right in the sweet spot. If you're ambassador to Russia or China or some of the biggies, that policy is really dictated almost all out of the State Department or the White House. With Turkey, an important country, 10th largest mission in the world, but they still rely on the ambassador there to work with the government to come up with a formulation to move a certain issue or item. So I was really fortunate that way. But it is very different from being kind of a free agent to representing the government, but fortunately I felt very comfortable in that role. Thank you.